Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. Today is day 25 of free AWS DevOps Zero to Hero series. And in this video, we will deep dive into a concept called as AWS Config. Now, if AWS Config deals with compliance, it makes sure that your AWS account or your AWS resources aligns with the rules and regulations of your organization. Now, this might find difficult for some of you. Compliance might be very new for people who are watching this video. So that's why what I've decided is, firstly, I'll start with the demonstration, which is very unusual. We usually start with the theory part, but for today's video, I'll start with the demo. I'll show you what exactly we are going to learn today, and then I'll come back and explain you the theory part. That way, all of you understand compliance, what exactly it is, and why and how AWS Config solves this problem, right? So for the purpose of demonstration, I have two AWS EC2 instances here. Okay, now let's say your organization has a defined rule. That is, whenever you create an EC2 instance, whoever creates it, it can be a DevOps engineer, it can be a developer. The thumb rule for your organization is that for these EC2 instances, monitoring should be enabled. That means if you go to this monitoring tab, there is a section called Manage Detailed Monitoring. And this checkbox you see here, it should be clicked. That means detailed monitoring should be enabled for your EC2 instances. Why? Because your organization might have some rules that any EC2 instance, if there is detailed monitoring enabled, you can always track what has happened to the EC2 instance. If there is any security issues, or if there is any issues with the application, you can auto detect what is happening, or you can integrate it with some monitoring tools. You can do whatever it is. Let's not go into the details of it, but let's understand that this is one rule of your organization. Now, if any EC2 instance is not adhering, that means if any EC2 instance is not following these standards, that means they are out of compliance of your organization. That means they are not following your organizational rules and regulations. So that's why I created another EC2 instance here. And let me show you that for this instance, the detailed monitoring is not enabled, right? So there is one EC2 instance that follows the standards of your organization, or that follows the compliance of your organization. And there is another EC2 instance that does not fit into the compliance of your organization. Now, who will take responsibility of it? Like, there is this huge AWS account. There can be thousands of EC2 instances, not just EC2 instance. This applies for different resources, right? For example, your organization has a rule that all the S3 buckets should have lifecycle management enabled, or public access disabled. So now, who is responsible for looking at all of these things? And how will you ensure that your AWS account adheres to the compliance rules and regulations of your organization? As a DevOps engineer, it's your responsibility. Now you might be thinking that, but Abhishek, how can I do all of these things? So for that very own reason, AWS provides a resource called as config. Okay, so what you can do here, you can simply search for config, and you will find this section called as track resource inventory and changes. Okay, so open this one. Now this is the AWS config, and using this, basically you can verify how many resources are compliant and how many resources are non-compliant. Okay, so if you see here, I have already configured this one. I'll show you how I have configured this, what we are going to do, everything I'm going to show you. I'm going to use Lambda functions, but for now, just understand that, see, I've created this one and I'm showing in the compliance status that there is one resource that is compliant and there is one resource that is non-compliant, right? If you watch the resources section, there is one resource that is compliant and one is non-compliant. Okay, now how did I do it? Basically, you can go to AWS config and you can configure set of rules. I'll show you very detailed how to create these rules, how to configure them, how did I write the Lambda function. I'll share the Lambda function code in the GitHub repository so that you can also perform this demo and you can also feel confident about AWS config. Don't worry about it. But for now, just understand that in this AWS config, you can create a bunch of rules. Now, what did I do? I've created a rule here. And in this rule, what I've done is I'm verifying, okay, there are so many EC2 instances, right? So here I have configured how many EC2 instances are compliant and how many EC2 instances are non-compliant. Now, how did I do it? Basically, when you create a rule here, you can integrate this rule with Lambda function. Okay, this AWS config will tell you when an EC2 instance is created, when an EC2 instance is updated, when an EC2 instance is deleted. Every event notification is sent to the function that you are configuring. There are some default rules. Okay, AWS config. That means AWS also provides you some default rules. You can use those default rules, but as a DevOps engineer, you have to write the custom rules as well. Now, this is a custom rule that I have written. How did I write this custom rule? So in the AWS config, I told to monitor the compliance of EC2 instances. And how to monitor? I'll provide you a custom script. That is, I'll provide you a Lambda function. Basically, you have to call this Lambda function whenever a EC2 instance is created or modified, right? So what it will do is it will call this Lambda function, and within the Lambda function, as a DevOps engineer, you have to write the code. What will that code be? You have to fetch the details of the EC2 instance, right? Let's say this EC2 instance is changed. Now AWS config will call the Lambda function that you have configured with all the details of this EC2 instance. Now within the Lambda function, you have to read every configuration, and what you will do is basically you will verify if this EC2 instance has monitoring or not. For example, what did I do here? I have written a Lambda function. So now this is the Lambda function that I've written. Okay. And in this Lambda function, what I've done is I have written the code. I'm fetching the event details. See here, what I'm doing, I'm getting the instance ID from the entire JSON that the AWS config has sent to this Lambda function. So what is the trigger to this Lambda function? Usually when I explained you about Lambda functions, I've explained you basically Lambda functions are event driven, right? They are serverless, but they are event driven. That means someone has to invoke the Lambda function. In this case, AWS config is invoking the Lambda function. And what I'm doing is I am verifying if the EC2 instance has monitoring state enabled or disabled. If the monitoring state is not enabled, okay, I have a not condition here. If the monitoring state is not enabled, then I'm saying that the EC2 instance is non-compliant, and I'm sending all this information to the AWS config. I'm using Boto3. I'll explain you this entire code, how I'm doing it. But for now, what you need to understand is the concept of compliance. So let me show you that, for example, this instance has monitoring enabled and this one did not have the monitoring enabled, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this instance. Okay. I'll edit the monitoring section. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to enable this one. Now you will see that within a couple of minutes, this EC2 instance, because it is updated, the AWS config is going to continuously watch for the instances, because you told it that, okay, I'm writing a rule for compliance of EC2 instances. So it will continuously monitor the EC2 instances. So if you go to the edit section, you will see that I have configured. So here I said what resources to watch. I said EC2 instances is something that you have to watch. I am going to explain you that later point of time, how to write this config rule. But so the EC2 instance is changed. This config rule is going to trigger this Lambda function. Now what this Lambda function is going to do, it is again going to check that, okay, is the status enabled or disabled? This time the status is enabled. So what should be the output here, right? The output should be, if I click on all buckets, sorry, if I click on all the resources, I should see both of them are compliant. Let me refresh and see. It takes a couple of minutes. Don't worry. Okay, it's not yet refreshed. How did I know? Because I'm checking the time. Okay, so there is a time here which is called last execution. So the last execution is 8:33. That means I know that it is not yet triggered. So let's refresh and wait for this entire process to complete, because there are multiple components, right? So you can see this one, last successful detective evaluation. So let's wait for one more minute. So I'm going to share this entire code, the steps on how to do it in the GitHub, right? And you can watch this entire thing. You can use the GitHub repository. You can copy the Lambda function code and you can also try it. But better you try this entire Lambda function and this entire configuration by yourself first. I hope this is done. Let's give this one more minute. So yeah, like I told you, it will take a couple of minutes. So meanwhile, let's wait. Okay, I actually waited for 3 to 4 minutes, but still it is not getting updated. So let us see what is happening, right? So whenever there is an issue, we have to troubleshoot it. So how do you troubleshoot? Whenever there is some issue on the AWS, the first thing or the first place that you would go is the CloudWatch, right? So let me go to CloudWatch. And in the CloudWatch, there will be a log group for the Lambda function, right? So go to the log group section. And within the log groups, just look at the latest log group that is available. Okay, so here, this is the log group for the Lambda function. And see, this is the time. Now let's go into this and see what has happened. Okay, so the init action start is performed, end request. So there are no failures. Let us see what has happened. Okay, there is good. Okay, it says that the task has timed out after 3 seconds. I mean 3.06 seconds. Usually, you know that for Lambda functions, the default execution is just 3 seconds. So let's try to increase that. Okay, so let's go here. Click on the edit button. Okay, go back to the function. Go to the configuration. Okay, go to the general configuration. Here the timeout is 3 seconds, right? So let's try to improve the timeout to let's say 10 seconds. Okay, usually it does not take 10 seconds, I know, but let's try to increase it. Okay, now increase the timeout, successful, right? Now let's go back and whenever there are these kind of actions, you have a section here called click on the action button and click on reevaluate. Okay, in your case, basically you can give the timeout as 10 seconds by default. I did not expect that it would take more than 3 seconds, but that's fine. Okay, now I'm hoping it to update this configuration. Let me refresh. Okay, the time of invocation is 9:40, which is perfect. Now click on all button. Okay, let us see if both of them are compliant or not. Perfect. Now you might be thinking that Abhishek, can you show me one more time? Yeah, definitely. Now what I'll do is I'll go back to this initial bucket. Okay, click on the instance ID and then click on the monitoring. I'll just take 1 minute. After that, we'll go to the theory part, which is very, very important. Now click on confirm. Okay, so now I clicked on the confirm. Now the monitoring is disabled. Again, this rule should automatically get triggered. Let's refresh. It should automatically get triggered and see 9:41 it got triggered. And here if I look at the buckets, at least I should see one bucket as non-compliant. Okay, let's wait, because I've disabled the monitoring. At least I should see one of these buckets as non-compliant. Okay, let us see here. Instances, did I disable properly? Monitoring. Okay, it's disabled. Let me click on reevaluate once to see what is happening. We can go to CloudWatch and see what is happening. If there is any issue, that's not a big deal. Okay, if you see here, the invocation is still at 9:41, but it should be updated to 9:42 or 9:43. Okay, fine. Let's go to CloudWatch and see what has happened. This one here, log groups. There should be one new log group. Okay, let's wait for it. Perfect. Okay, let's click on this one and let us see here what has happened. There is nothing. Okay, everything seems good. Perfect. See, there is one bucket as non-compliant. Okay, I just had to wait for a couple of minutes. Like I told you, you have to be patient. Sometimes it takes 2 minutes, sometimes it takes 3 minutes, sometimes it can also take more than that. But what you can do is you can go to the Lambda function, you can go to the CloudWatch and verify if everything is perfect or not. Okay, so it's good. Whenever we are doing the demos, I prefer not to edit it because you are seeing here what is happening. And even when you try to perform the demonstrations, you will not be scared, or you will not worry that something has happened at your end. Okay, so it's quite common. Now let's start with the theory part. You understood what has happened, but let me elaborate, and then let me also show you the code part. Okay, so here basically AWS config, like I told you, what happens with AWS config is that, okay, so in your organization there can be different kind of rules. For example, you are working for a government project, okay, or you are working for a banking project, okay, or you are working for a financial sector project. Okay, so depending upon your organizationals, your organizations, your domains, each and every organization have their own compliance rules. Okay, so one organization might say that all the S3 buckets that you are creating should have a life cycle management enabled. For some organizations this might not be important. For some organizations, like I showed you, the EC2 instance monitoring enabled must be mandatory. Okay, this can be for some organizations, whereas for other organizations this cannot be that important. So what you need to do as a DevOps engineer, you have to take a list of the mandatory things for your organization. Okay, for some organizations, creation of tags for each and every EC2 resource, sorry, AWS resource is important. So depending upon organizational rules, what you need to do as a DevOps engineer, you have to take a note of all of these mandatory things. And these things are called as compliance. Okay, and you have to ensure that all the resources in your AWS account are basically compliant to your organizational rules and regulations. Okay, so one such example that I've taken is this one, that is EC2 detailed monitoring. Now you might be thinking, okay, Abhishek, how will I come to know about these things? No, you don't have to worry about it. You can verify, like, whoever is your point of contact, it can be your manager, or it can be any other person. You can just ask them, like, I want to set up the compliance rules, I want to set up AWS config, and I want to verify how many resources are compliant and how many resources are not compliant, and I want to give you a detailed information. Can you provide me detailed set of rules and regulations that you are looking for, right? So this is what you do using AWS config. Now this is very, very important because compliance is related to security. Whenever there is something related to security, your organization takes that as the highest priority. Now let's see how did I do it actually, right? So I told you that you need to create a AWS config rule, but how do you actually create a rule? It's very simple. Click on the rules button. Now there is already a rule, but what I'll do is I'll add a new rule, which is very similar to what we have done. Okay, so because you can also watch it and do the demo in the same way. Click on add AWS managed rule, create Lambda rule, or create custom rule using God. Put this aside for a while. So now you have two options: add AWS managed rule or create custom Lambda rule. Go for this because, sorry, go for this one, sorry, because AWS managed rule is very, very simple to set up. You don't have to do much there. There are AWS managed rules that are available here, and all that you need is, let's say what your organization is looking for is already available here. You can just click on this button and everything is done. But I want to show you slightly complicated option, or slightly difficult option. So click on create Lambda rule. Click on the next button. Provide a name for your rule. Test demo. Provide some description, whatever you would like to. And here you need to provide the Lambda function ARN. So what you will do is firstly create a Lambda function. You can just create a dummy Lambda function. Now in my case, I already have a Lambda function. right? We can go here, we can copy the Lambda function ARN. But beforehand, I mean, before you start these things, that is before you start creation of the config rule, you need to have the Lambda function ready. Okay, so that you can copy the Lambda function ARN and paste it here. Then, okay, this is fine. You can ignore this option. There are two different things. One is when configuration changes, other is periodic. Periodic is like a cron job. So you can tell that trigger Lambda function every day at 5 o'clock, trigger Lambda function every day at 2 o'clock. But I don't want that. What I want is this option, when configuration changes. Okay, so you might have seen that whenever there is a change in the EC2 instance, immediately my config rule is updating whether the instance is compliant or non-compliant. That is much better than periodic action, right? So here you can select what kind of resources you are looking for. Click on the resources, and here you can search for AWS resources EC2. Search for EC2 instance. Okay, now you can add for any resource identifiers, like, okay, what kind of resources do you want to look for? But that's okay. I want to look for all the EC2 instances. I don't want to add any resource identifier. Okay, scroll down. Here rule tags. Similarly, you can say that particular key value pair. Okay, so let's ignore that as well. Click on the next button. Click on save. Okay, now this rule is created, which is called as test demo. And within the rule, you said that whenever a EC2 instance is created, modified, updated, whatever happens to the EC2 instances, just trigger this config rule. And what this config rule will trigger? It will trigger this Lambda function. Now your entire magic stays in this Lambda function. Okay, so you need to write Lambda function which ensures that it gets the information of the EC2 instance, whether monitoring is enabled for that EC2 instance or not, and update the status back in the config rule. Okay, so how to write this entire Lambda function? One is I'm going to show you how to write it. The second thing is what permissions are required for this Lambda function, right? Whenever one AWS service or whenever one AWS resource is talking to another AWS resources, what is required? A IAM rule, sorry, a IAM role with policies is required, right? So this Lambda function that you are going to create, you can do two things. One is, what you can do is, let me show you from starting. You can click on create function, create from scratch, uh, write the Lambda function. Okay, probably just call it test demo or something. Use Python. Here you will have two options, right? Do you want to use the default Lambda function role, or you want to use an existing role? Whatever you would like to. So just go with the default role if you don't have any Lambda function already, and click on create function. And this same function URL or the ARN you will provide in the config rules, right? That is what I did here. I have provided the same thing in the config rule ARN. So the config will trigger the Lambda function. Okay, go back to the create function. Your function once created, you have to write this code that is available here. Sorry, I'm slightly getting confused with the tabs. Yeah. So click on the function, click on this one. So this is the code. I'm going to place this entire code in the GitHub. But let's try to understand what I've done here. I'm also going to explain what permissions are required for this Lambda function so that you can also grant the same permissions. Okay. If you go to the configure option here, if you go to permissions, so this is your role name. Just click on this role name. This is your IAM role, and you have to grant it some set of permissions. Okay, let's see what did I grant. So I've granted these permissions to my Lambda function. You can take a screenshot of it, or you can grant the same permissions. It's up to you. How do you want to do it? Either take a screenshot and watch the screenshot and give the same permissions, or you can pause the video here and grant the same permissions. So these are the ones: CloudWatch full access, EC2 full access, config role, CloudTrail full access. You don't have to give the full access, but initially when you are performing the demo, if you don't know what permissions are exactly required, you might fail or you might do this demo multiple times. So initially start with this full access, then move towards the least privilege. Okay, now let's jump onto the Lambda function again. code. What am I doing here? If you are finding this page difficult to understand, okay, I'll increase the font size, but still if you are not finding it easy to understand, you can also go to the GitHub repository. You can find the GitHub repo in the description and you can watch that thing while I'm explaining, but anything is fine. uh, Here usually you have the lambda handler function, right? So inside the lambda handler is the one that is going to be invoked by the lambda function, or sorry, by the function that is triggering this lambda function, right? So let's say here AWS config rule is triggering the lambda function. So this is the first function that it calls. Similar to like, let's say you are writing a Java application, main is a function that gets called first, right? When you execute the Java class, then main function is the one that gets executed. Similarly, by default, if you're not changing it, when you run a lambda function, lambda handler is the one that is going to be invoked first. So I have imported Boto3 and JSON because I'm going to use Boto3 to talk to the AWS resources, because I'm writing in Python. And why I'm using JSON? Because like I told you, this AWS config rule, it is taking the EC2 instance complete information and sending you as a JSON. Okay. So that's why first I've created a EC2 client in the Boto3. If you're not aware of Boto3, then for this video, you can just watch these things as is, because I'm going to do a dedicated Boto3 session where I'm going to explain you how to use Boto3, how to interact with the AWS resources using Boto3. For this class, it will be completely out of discussion and it will be a complete different topic. So I don't want to diverge. For now, just understand that I'm using this Boto3 module and I'm creating a EC2 client. Okay. And then I'm setting up a variable. Okay. The default value for this variable is compliant. Okay. By default, I'm assuming that everything is compliant in my AWS organization or the resources that it is watching for. Then I've taken this JSON payload. So event is the one that the AWS config has given to this Lambda function. Whatever JSON it is providing, this Lambda function is part of the event. So from the event, basically what I'm doing in these steps is I'm getting the instance ID. Okay. From these steps, basically I'm getting the instance ID. And here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to describe the instance and I'm trying to get the monitoring status of the instance. Okay. So here I got the complete JSON payload of the instance. And then from there, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to verify what is the monitoring state. If the monitoring state is not enabled, then convert the bucket as non-compliant. Whether it's me who is writing this Lambda functions or anybody who is writing the Lambda functions using Boto3, we all refer to the Boto3 documentation. Even when I wrote this one, I refer to the documentation and I've written this, but still saying that I'll do a dedicated video on Boto3 and I'll explain you how to write this Lambda functions. So don't worry about it. Finally, as part of the evaluation, I'm just updating, this compliance section. Here, whatever you see is the compliance section that is getting updated in the AWS config. Okay. Finally, I'm just returning the response and calling the AWS config. So this is the config client, which means that I'm invoking this AWS config, or I'm calling this AWS config from the Lambda function using these values. Okay. Using this JSON or using this, using this information, I'm calling this AWS config. I'm passing all of this information, which will update the values that you are seeing here. Okay. So who has updated these values? These values are updated by the Lambda functions. I hope this is clear. You can get this complete code in the GitHub repository using the description. I mean, you can check the description. There will be a GitHub repository, and please try to perform this at your end. And if you think you have understood this completely, you can change this example to S3 bucket. Okay. All that you need to do is when you're creating this rule, instead of EC2, just check for S3 buckets. Okay. You will find S3 buckets, and this config rule, whenever a bucket is created, deleted, modified, updated, it will call the Lambda function that you are trying to write. Now you can take a very basic example. You can see if the public access is enabled or not. Write the Lambda function accordingly and verify if the status is updated here or not. So this is the video for today. I hope you have enjoyed it. This is a very, very useful video. Many organizations do it. Many DevOps engineers in their organization implement this kind of projects, which is very, very real time. So I hope you will use it in your resumes if required, or during your interviews, you can convey this thing. Thank you so much again for watching it. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.